Hi guys, welcome to my garden. So I've been trialing a few different devices and different hooks and ways to hang our pots as well as tag our pots, different plant tags and identification markers over the past few months and years. And for the last couple of weeks or so, I've been purchasing a range of items off Temu and Amazon and giving those a try to see how they make life a little bit easier in a large garden. So what we'll do is go for a walk around and have a look at a few of those specific items for you so that we can see how effective they have been. One of the ones that I did purchase were those brackets that are adjustable. So they're spring-loaded, which is really good. To secure the plants in place. They also move the plants away from the rails so that they're not affected by the heat if they're exposed to heat during the day. I also was using the stainless steel hooks, which over time, I think they're galvanized. Over time, they corrode or rust, and so I'm trialing these ones that are encased in a plastic sort of coating, and they're sealed on both ends, and so far they've been pretty good. Haven't noticed any differences in the last few months from when I started using them versus some of the galvanized ones or the so-called stainless steel ones have been deteriorating a little bit in the summer sun. Now, in this area, those pot holders have been fantastic as a way to utilize some vacant space in the greenhouses. So they come in a range of sizes. The couple of different sizes I got were 200 mil, 20 centimetre ones, as well as some smaller ones went down to 145 mil. So they hold the smaller pots, and that's what those ones are, 14.5 centimetres. But they do elevate the plants and free up some space, which is valuable in a greenhouse, easily attached to just the weld mesh panels and then secured in place, and then the pots can be put in and removed without any problem. So they were really effective. Plant tags, lots of different varieties. Our standard plant tags, obviously, our normal nursery plant tags. That one's written in pencil, which is a problem. It's difficult to read it, and it does over time fade. So the graphite doesn't last as long as it used to, depending on what pencil you use. But I mean, I've been using a builder's pencil and they've just not been cutting the grade, so to speak. So I moved over to writing with the garden markers, outline garden markers, about 5 or 6 years ago, and haven't noticed any issues with them fading versus do not use a Sharpie. They will fade in a couple of weeks, if not months. So you need to be aware of that. The type tags, those ones there, those ones were printed, as you can see, in 2020, so 5 years ago. No fading. So that's really good to see that they've lasted in the greenhouses in our inclement weather without any problems at all. What did fail were these little adjustable hangers. The moment you put a pot plant on them, they straight away retract and drop down, and they're not catching. So even a light pot hasn't been effective in using them, unfortunately. So I won't be using any of those in the garden. Don't know what I'm going to use them for, but can't use them in the garden. The coloured nursery tags, the pot tags to hang on the side of the pots, they come in a range of colours. And for me, they've been perfect because I'm using them to identify different hybridisers. So I can look down my tunnels of Bill Burgess hanging, and I can identify immediately, just looking at the colours, who grew that plant originally, who's a hybridiser. So red, for example, is Neil Bain, blue is my Talbot, purple are my Kiwanis, green are Russell Holsteiner. So I can scoot down the greenhouse very easily and identify who grew what plant, not to mention finding the plants. Now, as I walk down the tunnel, I'm walking on a decline, so my plants are getting higher and higher above my head, which makes it impossible for me without my glasses on to read that identification label, which with glasses on, yeah, that's a Kiwana. Well, I know that because it's purple. It's a Kiwana, and I think that says Harbour Lights, but I can barely read that, and I'm only standing an arm's distance away. So it makes it really difficult to identify them. So the darker written tags are a lot easier to identify than those pencil written tags. So I definitely would prefer to use the pens that I know are not going to deteriorate over time. As I go along, they get higher and higher, so it makes it more and more difficult to identify the plants. And when there's literally hundreds of them hanging, trying to find a plant for a customer or a client or a friend or myself, trying to find a plant amongst them all, it makes it a little bit easier for me to actually go along, and I've catalogued all of these plants so I know the position of them in the greenhouse. So as I remove them, they have to go back in the same place, or I've got no chance of finding them again. But to make our lives easier, I've got those little S-hooks that I've attached to the galvanised pipe. That makes it really easy to remove the plants from their hanging position. When they're not on those S-hooks and they're just on the wires and the pipe, the shade cloth is pushed up against it, and it makes it really difficult to manoeuvre the hangers off. So, and then getting them back in, they kink, and it's really difficult. So those hangers, just that little tiny addition of the little S bracket, makes it so much easier to take a pot off and then put it back on again. So they've been really successful. One of the better things that I bought. So luckily I bought 300 of them. I probably need 3,000 of them. But 300 is not a bad start. So they've all been used today and hung up. I've gone along and experimented with a range of pens, pencils and tapes over the last few years, and different tags. Certain tags are really good, certain tags are not. These really slim tags that you quite often find in places like Bunnings, for example, very brittle and snap very quickly after a couple of years in the sun, so they're not particularly great for long use. The skinnier, thinner tags that are still flexible, they last a little bit longer than the really narrow ones, so they're okay. But again, it just depends on what you're using them for and how long you plan on having the plants for. Keeping them identified is really important. These tags are different again. These ones come in a roll of like 3,000, and you can get them printed as well. I can get them printed at our local orchid supply store, and I can have them printed up with whatever details I want, in as many as I want. So I can have, out of that 3,000, I could say a couple of hundred near Regelia, a couple of hundred Bilbergia, and they'll all come printed on the roll, and then I can separate them. It's just another option, and they last pretty well in the sun. These ones have been out in the sun for several years. They're not breaking or brittle, which is what we were told wouldn't happen. So it's been good to trial them for several years and see that they actually are standing up. But what does happen, unfortunately, is they still cause some fading on the tags themselves, even writing with that garden marker pen. So the garden marker pen works really well on the really firm tags, but not as well on the softer tags, just for those that are looking at different options. The aluminium tags, of course, they last for pretty much ever, until eventually they disappear. So this is one of the aluminium tags that's been attached to a pot so that I can just keep an eye on them. But they're all going to get used in the Tillandsia house for identification of the Tillandsias, because I do use aluminium tags that have been made for me. These ones cost a little bit more to have made, but it was a convenience thing, really. So as you see, very busy in the greenhouses. This greenhouse is the Bilbergia tunnel, and the Bilbergia tunnel on this side of the property is a 12-metre long tunnel that's 3.2 metres high, and it's really difficult for me to have access to any of the plants that are hanging in the middle. So they're on 75 centimetre wires that then lead to their 40 centimetre or 45 centimetre bracket. So it brings it right down to a height that I'm able to reach across their head height. So I can reach across and remove the pots from their hooks. I can identify and I can read those tags pretty well. But the plants that go in the middle there, are usually permanently there, so they haven't moved for many years, and so I know what they are from sight. When I start moving around 2,000 odd bilbergia for repotting purposes and tidying them up, it's easy to get confused as to where they all belong. Tried a lot of different ways to identify them. I've tried alphabetical. That only works until you get another plant and you need to fit it in when you're buying plants. I've tried grouping them to the hybridizer. So a lot of these are Olive Trevor's Canvey, for example. There's not as many of her hybrids, so they can sort of all be put together. Whereas when it comes to Kiwanis or Kalan, so Stuart Beasley's or Russell Holsteiners, there's just far too many to keep them all together. So they require different light requirements as well to bring out their colour. So they get moved around the greenhouse a little bit more. So I don't do alphabetical, and I don't do by the hybridizer. I do by the plant's requirements. So the side of this greenhouse, for example, is 30% black shade cloth, and the top is 50%. That's what I require for my son. Where I live on the property, this greenhouse is an east to west facing shade house. So it gets a lot of exposed morning sun. Now towards the afternoon, it's starting to go into a shaded period, which is really good because the sun is up quite high above me. And it misses that really hot afternoon sun. But then the sun does swing around, and then my pandanus palms, they protect the plants from intense burning heat. However, the Neoregelia, which are over the end of this tunnel, is a completely different zone. Even though it's literally at the end of the bilbergia tunnel, we move into the Neoregelia area. So these plants are under 80% black because of this afternoon sun, because those pandanus palms and banana trees are no longer preventing that sun directly above them, and it's scorching westerly afternoon Queensland, coastal sun. So it requires a different shade cloth here. So they're in 80%. Same with the tunnel. As I enter the tunnel, it's 80% as well, because there's Varesia here as well. And all of my dark Eekmeas or dark Neoregelias like to grow in a little bit less light. So they're under 80%, but there is a tree above them to give them some extra shade for that afternoon. Once they've been established in a certain area, I tend not to move plants once I find what they like. And it's because if you start to move them around, they lose their colour. Malbec is a perfect example, and this is Malbec here, Neoregelia Malbec. Malbec is really happy in this position. It gets a little bit of direct westerly afternoon sun, but not directly all day long, so it just gets enough to colour it up. But if I move that plant, it completely washes out and loses all its coloration. So moving plants is something I don't like to do too often once they've found their position. It's just finding the position, and because it's been a very strange wet season for us in Queensland, in the lower parts of Queensland, we've had really high rainfall and lots of cloud, and so the plants are very soft. And now that we've come into the end of summer and we're getting intense heat through the gardens, it's burning plants even that have been here for several years in the same position. So I've had to do a little bit of adjusting and use covers and things like that to give them some extra protection as well. Also been doing some tree lopping, and so that has also changed the light requirements of some of the plants in this area. But hanging up on the galvanised wires or hooks helps to bring the plants down to a better height as far as when I'm working with them, so that I can bring them down easily. Majority of them are on tables working, at a height that's adjustable and easily able to be maintained. But bilbergias like to hang up, and they like to have some pretty intense light, so they're pretty high up in the nursery. So I personally can't go up and down ladders too many times, and I don't like to go up and down ladders too many times, and that's because of injuries and also because of reception. And I'm on a property, and if I fall, which I've done several times, there's no one to hear me. So I don't like going up and down ladders, and my husband doesn't like me not going up and down ladders. So we have a constant battle. So he likes the fact that some of these plants are now at a more accessible height. There's the chain link little extra brackets that I've used on the top of the greenhouse there, and that's on the apex of the greenhouse, so we're 3.2 metres high, and I've used the chain link to bring the pots down an extra 20 centimetres before I add them onto their 45 centimetre hook, which is just enough that I can barely touch the bottom of the pots, so I can unhinge them and remove them to either remove pups, to spray the plants, to weed them, or just to move them around depending on what their light requirements are. So I like these chain wires as long as they don't deteriorate. They give the plants plenty of movement and enough distance away from the shade cloth that they're easy for me to access. The rest of this greenhouse has had all of the hooks attached so that the plants are now off the weld mesh, because it's really hard to get these types of hooks up amongst that weld mesh and get them back off again, besides which the plants are very close to touching the weld mesh, which heats up through the day as well, so I don't like that. So just 5 centimetres there, and it just brings them down enough so that the plants are not touching that weld mesh and getting any scorching. Plus it also makes it easy for me to have access to them, which is really important. Now last week was weeding. It's still going on, but it's better. So I used Slasher on this part of the garden. Slasher is an organic enzyme used for killing of the weeds, and I can use it close to the pots really easily using the electric Ryobi 7.5 litre garden sprayer that I use. So that's how much one of those concentrated containers of Slasher worked. It only did one container for me, but it made me able to do the paths, which you can see are completely weed free. This path was an absolute nightmare. It was covered in weeds, but it's all died off, which is really good, and all that's left is just the stalks. Now, it won't stop the development of seedlings. So even though it's only been just over a week, there's lots of little babies popping up, and that's because we've had rain. And so in another couple of weeks, this will be full of weeds once again. So it is going to have to be maintained. Most likely I'm going to hit it with something a little stronger. But yeah, other than that, it's just constant maintenance in the garden and finding places to hang all of the bilbergias so that they're all happy, and there's so many of them, and trimming trees and doing work. But it is a constant around the clock sort of activity when you've got a large garden that needs maintaining. The stands are really good, multiple tiered stands, and then pot holders again up across the top row, so that instead of just a blank shade house, I've been able to utilise that wasted space using the 200ml pot holders and popping in some pretty large bilbergias to give me an extra shelf up there. All of the Neoregelias on the ground have all been lifted off just onto some weld mesh sheets with a couple of used old black pots beneath them instead of Besser blocks. So I'm not lifting heavy weights, I'm just using pots beneath them to hold up the weld mesh and put the Neoregelias up off the ground, so it keeps the pots clean, because this is crusher dust, and so it does, you know, leave a mark on the pots when they're on the ground. So it keeps the pots clean as well, but it also gets the plants up off the ground for drainage reasons, as well as to make things easier, less insects able to eat them, and predation from, you know, mice and rats and things like that. And here it's bilbies and, it's bandicoots digging holes, or wallabies and koalas and all sorts of other animals, usually the wallabies having a bit of a nibble on the garden. So that weeding was really effective, especially in the tiled area or the paved area in Jen's garden zone. So all between the pavers are beautiful and clean, no weeds. So that area came up perfectly. So that's all I used was Slasher. It's just an enzyme. A couple of hours later, all of the weeds are dead. And then a week later, just gave it a rake over and it's all clean. So I really did and do use that product quite a few times for really quick maintenance on the paths. These paths now will all be relayed with crushed sandstone. That was the plan. I just needed to get rid of the weeds first. So now the weeds are gone, we'll move on.